Alright, hey YouTube, this is going to be my review. This is going to be a full review of the PowerColor Red Devil RX 7900 XTX. So I did manage to get one of these like I showed in my unboxing video. So if you guys are interested in the card itself, how it looks, how long it is, how it compares in size to a Fractal Torrent case, to other graphics cards, a reference graphics card, etc., then be sure to check that video out. But for today, we're going to be looking at rasterization. We're also going to look at ray tracing. Kind of like what I did with the XT. I decided just, for this one, I combined both of the benchmark lists into one video. So that's kind of how we're going to present it here. So just to kind of go over the card specs for those curious. So this is AMD's latest flagship graphics card that released in 2022. So we're at the very tail end of 2022. But going into next year, this is going to be their most expensive flagship offering, as far as I can tell. So the retail price of the reference card is about $1,000. So the PowerColor Red Devil is a custom AIB card, which is extremely quiet. We'll go over that later. But it's $100 more over the MSRP of the reference card. So $1,100 basically for the card that is reviewed as tested. So the specs are 96 CUs, and it's RDNA 3, so it's the third generation RDNA GPU. Game clock, 2.3 gigahertz. Boost clock is relatively going to be kind of in that range. I've seen it go to like 2.4, 2.6 about, somewhere around there at stock settings on the stock BIOS. The card does feature dual BIOS. 24 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory on a 384-bit bus. So this is an improvement over the last generation. You are getting 8 gigabytes of more memory compared to 16 gigabytes on the previous flagship, which was the 6900 XT. And then you have DisplayPort 2.1. So this is kind of a new selling point for this GPU because it's the only, this GPU and the XT are the only GPUs to release in 2022 to feature the DisplayPort 2.1 standard. The limited edition Red Devil does feature 3 DisplayPort 2.1 ports and an HDMI 2.1 port. It features the AV1 encode and decode. The encoder is the new feature. This was what debuted with Intel's Arc A770 and A750. So it's nice to have that on here as well. I kind of assumed it was going to be there, so there it is. And then 355 watt total board power. So just to go over the test setup, so I am testing it with the Ryzen 9 7950X. So the motherboard is the Aorus Master X670E motherboard. I featured this in multiple videos on my channel, whether we're talking about adding Thunderbolt 4. So it's a really nice motherboard. The G-Skill Ripjaws is what I'm using for the memory. So the RAM is going to be 64 gigabytes of Ripjaws S5, 5600 megahertz RAM. PSU is the MSI Meg AI 1300 watt. So this is a power supply that features the new PCI 5 plug for cards like the 4090. And then we're using a Fractal Torrent, and I have Smart Access Memory, aka Resizable Bar, enabled. So the driver that I used is still the launch driver. I did not test with the 12.2. I'm aware that there's a 12.2, and people did mention that in my live stream. But I wanted to sort of get a baseline of how this card functions at launch with a launch driver, just to have it comparable to how I tested the 7900 XT. So the first up is 3D Mark Time Spy. So this is DX12. Most of the tests that I did are going to be DX12. I do feature DX11, and then we are going to have ray tracing benchmarks later in the video, but you can kind of see the performance here. So it's a massive uplift over last generation. So pay attention primarily to, if you're looking at how this compares gen over gen, pay attention to the 6900 XT from 2020. So that's the RDNA 2 flagship. I did also include the benchmarks for the cut down 7900 XT that I do have for testing, and then there is also the 3080 Ti representing Ampere. So we do have some other GPUs here as well. For those who are curious, those that are probably on like an older GPU like Vega 64 or the 5700 XT, or even maybe the GTX 1080, or maybe even the 1080 Ti. If you're curious for the 1080 Ti, people who are still on 1080 Ti or the RTX 2080, pay attention to the RX 5700 XT. That's typically going to be in the same ballpark of what you would get if you were testing with that GPU. And then if you're on a 2080 Ti, pay attention to the 6700 XT. That's going to be the closest card to that GPU's performance. So here is test 1 and test 2, just to kind of give the numbers. I don't want to spend too much time on it because we do have a lot to cover in this video. So the first gaming benchmark is going to be Elden Ring. So this is, I tested at 1440p and 4K for all games. I did not test 1080p because I do not believe that anybody with a 1080p monitor, regardless of what the refresh rate is, should be considering a GPU that costs this much money. You're better served with a lower priced GPU for that resolution. So for 1440p, 133 FPS, everything is maxed out in this game. This game is kind of janky with the frame time, so the minimums are going to vary so much. 4K, you can see everything drops, but this GPU does manage about 90, like 89 FPS average. So that's really good to see in this title, because Elden Ring was Game of the Year for 2022, and it is my favorite game that came out this year. So I played a lot of this game. Next, we have Halo Infinite. This is going to feature the Slipspace engine, so it's another DX12 benchmark. So I don't play a lot of first-person shooters, but this is one that I do have access to. So I did test it just to kind of show the results here. It's a modern FPS, so it's a good one to include for testing. You can see 151 FPS at 1440p. If we move on to 4K, it's still over 100 FPS at ultra settings. So you can see very playable with everything maxed out. It's a very good result. Next we have Resident Evil Village. So this is going to be a DirectX 12 benchmark featuring Capcom's RE engine, which I've always thought is a very good engine. It ports to the PC from console releases very well. They've used this for games like Devil May Cry 5, which has phenomenal performance for an action game. I think it's a good representation of predictable performance or expected results, I'll say, in terms of what you can see. You can see it's very linear scaling across the board, gen over gen. You can see how, even with the NVIDIA cards, you can see how the 1080 to the 3080 Ti, there's a predictable uplift there. And then you can see the 20 series would fall somewhere in the middle here alongside these other GPUs. So very good results here across the board for all of them. At 4K, everything is still very playable except for the very old Vega 64 and the 1080. And keep in mind, this is 4K with ultra settings, so everything's maxed out. So if you have something like a 2080 or something older, you could drop the settings down to high and then you'd still be above 60. So very good engine overall. So moving on, I did want to include an RTS game. I really don't play RTS games that much anymore, but this is one that is a modern one because Civilization 6 does feature DirectX 12 as a rendering API. So I did want to include it just to kind of show the performance. So here you can see 293 FPS at 1440p. So very, very playable, kind of overkill for a game like this, especially at this resolution. And then at 4K, it's still super high FPS, well above 144, which is the maximum refresh rate of my 4K monitor. So that's really nice to see. So next we have Final Fantasy XIV. So this is going to be a DirectX 11 based benchmark, and this is a very popular MMO, probably the most popular MMO throughout the course of 2022. Its popularity has waned a little bit throughout the year, but at the beginning of this year, back in January, there were terrible queue times to log in. So that's why I definitely wanted to include this game. This is probably my favorite MMO. So it is really nice to see very, very high performance here. 213 at 1440p. And then if we move on to 4K, 123 FPS average, minimum of 80. That's like super good for 4K, considering this game is DirectX 11. And it's kind of old, but an MMO, an MMO is a very good way to test for things like CPU bottlenecks, for one thing. So you can see we're not really CPU limited here. It's still going to be GPU limited, but you can see this is a really good result. Next, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So this one features the Foundation engine. You can use DirectX 11 for this game, but I did test with DirectX 12 because it's the more modern API, and I do think that going forward, more games that release next year and beyond are pretty much going to be DirectX 12 and maybe Vulkan. But this is going to be the majority of the titles In my opinion, I think DX12 is the way to go. So you can see really good results. The minimum at 1440p is higher than the average for all the other GPUs that I tested. And then if we move on to 4K, again, the minimum is still higher than even the average FPS of the 7900 XT. So really, really good results for 4K. So next, Horizon Zero Dawn. So this is a good game to show like PCIe bandwidth, because this game does scale, interestingly enough, with PCI bandwidth. Meaning, if you run your PCIe slot at X16, you're gonna get the maximum performance for this game. If you run it at X8, or like, you know, X4 for whatever reason, or if you're using like an eGPU for a laptop, you won't get anywhere near as much performance as if you were running it off of a desktop with a full X16 slot. But you can see this game does feature a frame rate cap of 120. So the top 4 GPUs, they're all maxed roughly at 120. You know, it says 119, but it's basically 120. And then if we move on to 4K, you have to run this game at 4K maxed out to actually run into a GPU bottleneck. So here at 4K, you can see the 7900 XTX is so powerful that it's almost hitting the maximum of 120 that this game allows. So that's really interesting. Next we have Far Cry 6. So Far Cry 6 was an interesting title because we got weird things where it's like the minimum was 113. So I had to look at stuff like the maximum to see kind of what the difference was between the XTX and the XT. So you can kind of see the results there. You know, 161 average, very, very good for 1440. And then for 4K, it's still really, really good results. You know, 125 is the average there. So, yeah, it seems really, really good for 4K. So now we're going to look at the ray tracing benchmarks. So I included the CRYENGINE free to download Neon Noir benchmark ultra preset because I still think this is a good one. This is a good synthetic one that's relatively easy to run. And interestingly enough, you can actually run this benchmark on GPUs that are not supposed to support ray tracing. So cards like Vega 64, the GTX 1080, they can actually run this benchmark. Now they won't perform very well, but they will actually show you ray tracing results for the CRYENGINE. So that's really nice to see. But you can see here, so at Ultra, at both 1440 and 4K, the 7900 XTX does predictable here. It offers the best results relative to the other cards tested. Next, this is probably the most interesting ray tracing benchmark that I did, and it's interesting because it's a full path tracing game, or I guess it's a full path tracing implementation. So when we talk of ray tracing, you know, there's multiple different ways to do that, but path tracing is really like a full-on 100% ray trace. It's like worst case scenario, or it's the most hardcore amount of ray tracing that you can push through a game engine or through the renderer. So you can see here, I tested with 2 different settings. So I tested at high global illumination and low global illumination. So you can see when you set it to high, and just so that we're consistent, the other GPUs that are featured here are all tested with high global illumination. So this does show you that NVIDIA's RTX renderer for Ampere is very well optimized for global illumination, because you can leave global illumination on high and the 3080 Ti is still getting, you know, 104 FPS at 1440 or 51 FPS at 4K. In order to get the same performance on the XTX card, I have to drop the global illumination setting, that specific setting, down to low, and then the gaming FPS is basically the same as the Ampere GPU. So that's really interesting to see. It's one of those things where path tracing is kind of a thing where I don't want to say it's an academic test, but I do think that going forward, more games that release in the future are probably not going to be as heavy on path tracing as Quake 2 or Minecraft. I do think that where this makes sense is taking a really old game and applying path tracing to it and getting a much more modern, nicer looking game. And I think Quake 2 does a really good job at showcasing that. So that's kind of where I think this stands. But let's look at some other ray tracing results here. So Resident Evil Max RT. So you can see this is one where the ray tracing, shadows, and reflections and the illumination settings are, you can max them out. You can still get really good performance across the board in this title. That's why I do like Capcom's RE engine, because I feel like it's probably optimized for consoles, but it still scales really well with PC hardware. Now we look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider with ray tracing set to Ultra at 1440p. You can see that the results are still really, really good. So if we look at the average and the minimum, and then I did do the 4K results in this title as well, actually. So yeah, so we've got, you know, 79 average at 4K at ultra ray tracing. So this game is another good showcase of ray tracing, I think, in terms of the predictable performance, in terms of the gen-on-gen improvement. You can see like the 6900 XT, the average was 50. Now we're averaging about 80 at 4K, so that's really nice to see. And then we have Far Cry 6. So Far Cry 6 is another one. So this game is unique. Its ray tracing approach, I won't say it's unique. It does use the DXR implementation of ray trace shadows. So it's kind of like one of those games where it's not as heavy on path tracing, but I do think that it is more of a common approach, which is probably what we're going to see more game devs use if they try to throw ray tracing into their upcoming games. So really good results overall here. And then even at 4K, you know, it's still 105. So ray tracing here is actually pretty good on this card. So the average ray tracing performance, just from the test that we did, you know, at 1440p, 142, and then at 4K, 95. So if you're looking at buying the AMD flagship GPU, you're kind of on the fence between this and the 4080. I would say if you want to do ray tracing, but you don't really care too much about it, this card definitely is worth it, in my opinion, just looking at the performance alone. It's not like the RTX 30 series ray tracing performance was bad by any means, and this card is kind of in line with that generation's ray tracing performance. So I guess the conclusion here is, for those wondering, the ray tracing of this card, the 7900 XTX, is kind of in line with the 3090 Ti. So that's kind of what I'm concluding from these results here. So the overall performance for the rasterization, so if we shift back now to the pure FPS, no ray tracing, you can see the relative performance here. It's at 1440p, it's 203 FPS. So that's a very high number for 1440p. In my opinion, that's considered overkill for 1440p. So if I were going to purchase a GPU for 1440p, and we'll look at some cost per frame numbers in a few minutes, this to me looks like, just by looking at the overall, this GPU is kind of overkill for 1440p. Like, this to me is a 4K GPU. The 7900 XT makes more sense as a 1440p GPU. And then at 4K, you can see this is where 133 FPS, and keep in mind that all the benchmark tests that I did were full ultra preset max settings, etc. So, and you're still pulling 133 FPS. This is definitely a 4K card, in my opinion, especially with the 24 gigabytes of memory. So fan noise on the Red Devil is very, very good. So the maximum I saw it spin, now keep in mind, I tested at stock settings, no overclock, no undervolt, because I know people are going to ask about that, but that's not the purpose of this video. Most people buy a GPU, they take it out of the box, they put it in their computer, and they start playing games. So that's the out-of-box experience is what we're reviewing here. So at out-of-box stock settings, the highest I saw on the fan was about 1275, somewhere just under like 1300 RPM. Just to give you guys an idea of the noise levels. That is insanely quiet on a massive 4-slot cooler. So the dBA number that I measured was 27 dBA. So it basically ties with the reference 6900 XT, but the reference 6900 XT, as you'll see, runs a lot hotter. So if we look at the temps here, now what I did was I took edge temp and hotspot temp and I averaged them together. So I weighed them both 50-50. So that's how I get these, that's how I got all these numbers that you see here on the screen. So you can see in terms of thermals, This cooler is very, very good considering the power consumption is pretty high, as we'll show here in a little bit. But you can see really, really good temperatures. So 74C, the lower the better. That's very, very good on a very high-end flagship GPU. Power consumption while gaming is higher. So 382 is what I saw on GPU-Z. I kind of took the max for multiple games, averaged that across the board, and this is kind of what we saw. So about 382 watts for the Red Devil limited edition out of the box on the primary BIOS, which is, I think, their default BIOS. The other BIOS is the silent BIOS. So fun fact for those that are interested in this card, if you want to get the AMD reference design performance numbers, you switch this BIOS on this card over to the silent BIOS. The silent BIOS on the Red Devil uses the same voltage power limits as the AMD reference card. So if you want to run it like a reference card, you switch it over to the second BIOS. And that makes it like dead silent. And then it just like drops the power consumption to the stock levels. So performance per watt, here the higher is better. So because this GPU has much higher power consumption compared to the XT does eke out a win slightly by 0.01, but it is still really, really good average performance per watt compared to all the other cards tested. Performance per dollar, so here lower is better. You want to see how much performance you can get at the lowest amount of money possible. So you can see here Intel still wins as the value king at $4.07 cost per frame at its MSRP price. So I am using the MSRP price. And remember, this is the Red Devil that's tested, which is $1,099 or about $1,100 versus $999 or $1,000 on the AMD reference card. So I did test, or I do the calculation based off of the actual price of the card tested. So that is the reason why this one does show up slightly worse than the 7900 XT, but the performance is still going to be a lot better, and that's probably why it's they're still within 20 cents or so between each other. So I would say that's probably going to be worth it long term. So the conclusion now. So who is the 7900 XTX for? So just as I said in the 7900 XT conclusion, basically anybody on an older AMD flagship GPU, I do think that this is your natural upgrade path. If you're this type of person who buys flagship GPUs, this is obviously a good choice. I would definitely recommend an AIB card like the Red Devil over a standard AMD reference card because it's much quieter, much better thermals, and it's just overall more well behaved compared to the reference card. The dual BIOS is there, so if you run it in reference spec, just go ahead and switch it over to the second BIOS, and you basically have the AMD reference card's settings on a much better cooler. And then for NVIDIA users, so that's going to be a lot of people. So if you're on the 1080 Ti and you held out until now, and you're kind of tired of NVIDIA raising the prices every generation on their flagships, if you want to reel them in, you kind of have to, vote with your wallet, so to speak. So I do think that this card, from my testing, the drivers are rock solid. I didn't run into any issues with the AIB card that I tested. The Red Devil, it's super quiet. It's massive, so you got to see if your case can fit one. But it's a really, really good flagship, and I do think that it is a worthy competitor to the NVIDIA RTX 40 series. In particular, this card outperforms the 4080 while being cheaper. Anybody on the 2080 Ti, 1080 Ti, basically any old NVIDIA flagship, and you're tired of NVIDIA raising the prices, this is kind of a good way to jump ship and switch sides to kind of teach them a lesson. They probably need to be knocked down a few pegs, and the way to do that is to vote with your wallet. So the other demographic I feel is anybody who upgraded to a 1440p or 4K monitor, especially 4K monitor, and then they now realize that the GPU that they have is now a bottleneck to the system, then this card definitely makes sense. So definitely, it's a good 4K graphics card. That's kind of the general conclusion. And then I guess the final category of people who I could see upgrading to this would be anybody who's on a mid-range RDNA 2, maybe an RDNA 1, or an Ampere 30 series GPU like a 3060 Ti that they bought, last year, and they had to overpay for it because typically those were going for $900 a year ago, even from the retailers like Newegg and Micro Center. You guys can look it up, look at the price history. It's all there. So if you guys, if someone bought a 3060 Ti and paid, about $900 for it about a year and a half ago, they probably regret that. Considering where we've come in like a good year, right? So GPU prices have fallen dramatically. So anybody who paid, almost $1,000 for a 3060 Ti probably is not happy with what happened. But if they are looking to either replace that by selling it to a friend or selling it in general, this would be a worthy upgrade because it was a massive uplift in performance, especially for 4K. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and end the video. Let me know what you guys think of the 7900 XTX in the comments below, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.